Hi, I'm Al Bismeyer, and I am the VP of Via Medici, and I'm very pleased today to have Andy Haylor, who will be sharing his insights and thoughts on MDM. Andy has been a thought leader in the IT space for north of 40 years, and he actually started out working with Shell, where he ultimately became responsible for global data management for the Shell Corporation. And subsequent to that, he actually founded a company which is an IT information management consultancy, and he's actually provided input to companies regarding master data management, both venture capital firms as well as organizations on the best ways to look at MDM and implement it and utilize it within their organizations and what's taking place within the marketplace. He's also been noted by Red Herring as one of the top 10 innovators as part of his career and background. So we're very pleased to have Andy here. He produces a report, the MDM landscape, and that's what we'll be discussing today. So thank you for taking the time, Andy. We really appreciate it, and we're looking forward to the discussion.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. Cheers, Al.
So one of the first things that I wanted to talk about is I noted in the landscape report that Via Medici had scored pretty high on the technology axis, and I wanted to get your feedback on how that was determined and that report in general. I think it's a great report and gives a good overview of the different players in the marketplace. And I was looking at the technology axis and wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. And there's two dimensions to that. One is about the market size. That's more about conventional stuff. And the technology access is determined by two factors really. One is sort of analyst assessment of the technology based on demonstrations and asking questions and so on. But the highest factor in that is actually customer satisfaction. And I believe that it's easy for vendors to come up with extremely convincing slideshows and sales pitches, and they can kind of pull the wool over the eyes of analysts a little bit, but the customers are actually having to pay for the software and actually having to implement the software and in production have probably a much kind of clearer idea as to whether the thing actually works in practice, is they're having to actually deal with software rather than PowerPoint slides. So we with all of the vendors that participate, we ask for a bunch of customer references, and we do a survey of how happy the customers are with primarily the software, but also the support organization and some other things as well. And Via Medici scored exceptionally high on this. So that's the primary reason why they were in such a good position in the report this year.
Thank you. I appreciate the feedback on that. I also noted when I was reading the report that it sounded like a lot of the information that's being managed by MDM these days is around digital. You have a number of different things from a digital management perspective, transformation. And in talking to other analysts and companies, it seems like that's a priority for a number of CEOs to kind of double down on digital and look at how they're working through that. Do you think that will continue to be a trend in MDM to manage those assets and kind of work through how that information is being displayed?
Sure. Well, I think digital transformation is it's sort of something of a buzzword, but nonetheless it is a significant movement or driver in general in the industry, and clearly with the way the world develops, we're not going to get less digital in the next few years. Let's put it that way. So I think that trend will continue. I think master data management just supports and contributes to these digital initiatives, because clearly having reliable essentially business context data, which is what master data is in a way, is kind of what you need if you're going to try to automate your business processes in a digital way. That's going to rely on a high degree of up-to-date, accurate, and so on, data about customers, about suppliers, about assets, about products, and so MDM is really a very supportive and complementary technology in that regard, and so will continue to be important just as it has been for a few years now.
Well, specifically as it pertains to digital transformation and digital management, do you see enhancements, or where do you see, from a functional perspective, what enhancements do you see being made to MDM to facilitate that for organizations in the future?
I think there are a few things. I think one thing that's reasonably clear is that there is a secular movement from on-premise software to cloud, whether that's public cloud or private cloud or hybrid environments, and that's obviously varies by industry and by company significantly in the pace of it, but it's pretty evident that it's happening. So as more and more applications are migrated to cloud environment, then clearly master data management software needs to go with them essentially, and as more and more master data is no longer in sort of sitting in the vaults in the data centers, but it's increasingly in cloud environments in key applications, but it's no longer within the corporate environment. Then the master data management tools need to adapt to that reality, and they need to be adept at managing a hybrid of sources from on-premise through to public cloud to private cloud, and in reality there'll be a mix, because nobody's going to switch over overnight, from on-premise to cloud in an instant. It's going to take a period of years, even for probably unless you're absolutely tiny SME. So I think that's one of the more significant things. I think another just a sort of future-looking aspect. I mean, one of the things about master data getting it right is if we think back about why we have an issue with master data. I mean, when we're talking about customer data and product data, what's happening is that any big enterprise has got a lot of different applications deployed out there. So of which ERP is only one. So I worked a few years ago with a very large oil company, not Shell, but a different one. And I mean, they documented that they had 600 separate significant applications in there deployed globally across their organization, and only one of those was SAP. So that's another 599 extra systems, many of which had data about customers and products and assets and locations and suppliers and so on. And so, when you think about all that, one of the big issues about master data management is trying to sort of, interrogate all those different source systems and try to decide on, if you like, which candidate for, the golden record for, say, product X or customer Y is the correct record. And if you've got 4 or 5 or 50, sort of versions of that, that's sometimes not trivial. So of course you can define survivorship rules about, certain systems more trustworthy than others. Some have been updated more recently than others, and you can do a whole bunch of things. But at the end of the day, there's still some degree of, sort of manual intervention that's frequently required to decide about this. So I think one of the things that MDM software can get better at, and it's beginning to in some cases, is to make more use of sort of machine learning techniques, where the software can look at what happens when a human domain expert reviews, sort of, for example, several different candidate customer master records and decides which one is the most reliable. Well, if it does enough of those and trains itself on enough people doing that, it should be able to get better at actually predicting the outcomes, and so if it does that well, then you should have a higher degree of automation that's possible. As you move forward, there'll always be some things which are difficult to for a machine to do, but in maybe in the 80% cases that are currently require human intervention to figure out which records are the correct ones, then maybe the MDM software can take advantage of the latest techniques to try to automate more of that.
That's really interesting. I actually one of the terms you used that I really liked is MDM being in the vault. And I think what I've been seeing a lot with customers is that MDM is becoming much more operational and much more real time. And so I'm kind of interested in your perspective on that. I mean, do you see MDM becoming more real time? And then what is the balance? I guess a combination question between what is master data management and transactional data, because it seems like those two worlds are starting to merge in some respects. And so I'm interested in your perspective there.
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, I guess that's right. I mean, clearly, people would like everything to be, instantaneous and up to date and so on. I mean, I think there are distinctions though between the level of volatility of data. So, if you look at, think of a business transaction, and you go into a store in the high street and you purchase a can of Coke or a bar of chocolate or whatever. So that's a transaction, and that happens immediately. It goes into the point of sale system, and that's it. So that's something that's immediately updated in the database, and we're done. But that transaction has got context. So it's got the context of what was the product that was purchased, what was the store location, what was the time of day, was it purchased with credit card, was it on is it with a customer who's got a loyalty card, and all that stuff around customers and products and locations, and that's the business context or the master data that's around it. So when you think about the distinction, of course they're linked, in a very direct way in this case, but also you also have to consider that the level of volatility of this data is somewhat different. So if you take the extreme case of sort of reference data, which is arguably a form of master data, really, then talk about things like currency codes and country codes. Well, I mean, you don't add too many new currencies, frequently. You don't get many new countries. I mean, you get the odd one, like every now and again, like some country splits up. You get the sort of Yugoslav, Yugoslavia breaks up into several countries years ago, or you have East Timor or something like that appearing. But those things are very, very stable. And then as you move through the sort of types of master data, then some things are more clearly more volatile than reference data. So customer, adding new customer accounts, adding new products, but you don't add new products every day. Very often. I mean, maybe you might add some SKUs in a supermarket or something, but you're not doing that every few seconds. Typically. So yeah, although they are sort of linked, I mean, I think inherently, many types of master data do have a sort of lower level of volatility than transactions, and particularly if you're trying to get to the sort of golden record stuff, then actually you can't in a way be completely real time, because your system there, system A, thinks it's real time because it thinks it's got the latest version, but is that true? Because back in head office someone has added a new new product hierarchy, or they brought in a new supplier and they've got some new coding structures and so on, and then someone's got to go and figure that out, whether it's a human being or whether it's some sort of artificial intelligence software, or whether it's some clever algorithm or some sort of business rules in an MDM system. But I mean, that can't necessarily all be done instantaneously, almost by definition. So I think it's true to a degree, but I think you just got to keep thinking about the use case of the volatility of the data, and what makes sense to be more real time and what realistically will not be.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that I see more companies trying to do things that forcing the master data to be transactional, where you want to say, hey, wait a second, this doesn't necessarily make sense. The problem is the tools are there to make it real time. And so, and they can extract, and, from a push versus pull perspective, they can, render information for an e-commerce is a perfect example, which actually is kind of my next question is, do you see people using master data for headless commerce? I mean, that's another question.
Yes, I mean, if you think about this term of headless commerce, which is really sort of trying to sort of separate, the front and back end of e-commerce systems, essentially, then I mean, I think master data is very complementary to that, because if you imagine if you're say a retailer, and you've got multiple channels for your product, so maybe you've got a store, you've got a website, you've got some kind of mobile app where people can buy things, you've got channel partners. You've got maybe you've got a printed catalog, in some places, right? And these are all separate channels, but all presumably selling the same, or essentially the same products, maybe with additional information or something, but mostly they're going to be the same. So if you're trying to sort of decouple the back end of the e-commerce system from the front end, because you want to do maybe a more tailored approach to particular customer groups, and that's the kind of example of when people talk about headless commerce, that's the sort of thing that they often come up with. Well, in that case, if you're going to making changes to say a product description, what you don't want to do is have this sort of tightly coupled thing where every single channel has to be updated, with its new product description. You want really to make that change in some separate place, in the back end, and have it ripple through all the separate channels and systems that are actually at the front end. And so in that way, having a master data management system, and particularly around, in this case, around product data, is exactly what you need. It's extremely complementary to this, because it does give you that degree of separation between the back end and front end of e-commerce.
No, that's interesting. So one of the things that you mentioned, or you kind of talked about, machine learning as an advancement for MDM, which I think is definitely in play for the future. But in terms of big sweeping ideas for MDM, where do you think MDM is going? What are the big changes that you see in terms of the solution set and the industry? Maybe that's a two-part question, but I'd like to get your feedback on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think MDM is a sort of no longer a pioneering, early industry. I mean, back in, I first, launched an MDM product in 2002, and that's sort of 20 years now since that was the first, arguably the first multi-domain MDM product. And so we've had 20 years now to kind of try and figure things out a little bit, and MDM's, clearly, matured significantly over that quite long period. So I think you've no longer got massive functionality gaps in the way that you used to have in the 2005 type timeframe, where products would just come to market, would just have huge gaping holes in what they could do. I mean, these days, it's been enough time now for the functionality to broadly catch up to the requirements of most customers. I think it's still the case, though, that MDM is not by any means universally deployed everywhere, and it's not, even if it's deployed within a company, it's not necessarily deployed all the way through an organization. And sometimes it'll be in one business line, or one geographic location, or one subsidiary, or one region. So I do think there's still a lot of growth potentially for master data management, because the implementation of it, I think, has been somewhat patchy. So I think the kind of things you will start to want to see more of as people scale up their implementations on a sort of global scale, is you need to start to look at, therefore, issues to do with performance and scalability, because maybe if you're a retailer, you've got hundreds of millions of customers or something, or you're telco or something like that, so you have to worry about volume and scale in a way you didn't before. On the other hand, you've now got the possibility of having cloud-based processes to deal with that for you, so that problem perhaps to a degree goes away, but you've still got to architect the product to deal with that. You have to start to think about the operational deployment of systems. If you're starting to roll MDM out across many countries within your organization, your synchronization of that master data between the master data system and the downstream systems from it, maybe passing data out to data warehouses or data marts, that suddenly, on a global scale, that suddenly becomes quite complicated. So you have to think about how you're going to manage that degree of all those different streams of data, and then what if you make some changes? What if you have a new product hierarchy or something in the central office? How does that get rolled out? So one of the I think potential areas there is this notion of federated master data management, which is something that is a kind of bugbear, because I guess I designed it into the products I had in 2002, putting it into Shell, and that was a very global company, and that, to me, it seemed like the obvious way to do it. But it wasn't obvious to a lot of to a lot of other people, because they were doing things on scale. But you are now starting to just get this sort of dimly aware notions now with some products that maybe they have to have some sort of network of federated data warehouse, MDM hubs, where there's some degree of synchronization between them, because perhaps you can't easily just have one giant hub to rule them all in the Lord of the Rings sense. You may actually have to have one per region or something, and there may be even some legislative reasons why that's an issue between sort of EU data protection laws and versus US, that kind of thing. You may not be able to have just one hub. So I think that in the future, I think there will be more demand. I've been saying this for a long time, so maybe I'm just wrong, but I think I think there will be more demand, at least, than there has been for genuinely sort of federated MDM solutions that are able to deploy across a whole global network of companies, because I just think that's the way that, at least for very large global organizations, that I used to work in Exxon and Shell, so I'm used to that. That's the way those kind of companies work, and obviously not everybody does, but for those kinds of companies, they need something that can deal with these kind of complexities of linking stuff up across 150 subsidiaries. And that's a different kind of problem from just dealing with the sort of monolithic master data hub in one country.
Well, so I'm familiar with federated MDM, but I'm not sure that our audience is. I mean, could you kind of describe that a little bit in more detail? Because I mean, if you think about it, is it such that you have one location that's driving localized things, or is it each local, you have a master at corporate, and then local can modify it for their specific region? Could you give a little bit of context?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to explain. So, I mean, at the simplest level, there are different ways you could design this, but at the simplest level, you might decide that something like you have a single corporate master data hub somewhere in head office, somewhere wherever that is. So in the case of Shell, it would be like the UK or the Netherlands. These days, it's the UK, I guess. But there will also be the local operating companies. So in the case of Shell, Shell Venezuela, or Shell Vietnam, or Shell in Japan, or Shell in the Netherlands, or Shell in the US, and it may be sensible, because one size doesn't necessarily fit all in these organizations, especially if you've got a decentralized kind of corporate culture. Then you may want to have at least regional sort of master data hubs that are linked to that sort of central hub, and it may be a sort of master slave thing where you're making update and centering, it ripples its way out through the network of MDM hubs, or another way it could even be a sort of bi-directional thing where you're taking changes from the region, and you have to obviously be careful about change management here, but dealing with ways of feeding that back into the central system. So that kind of notion of having more than one, let's put it that way, hub, is something which is quite, I think, a sort of design approach for master data management that will suit certain kinds of companies much better than just having a single monolithic hub. Let's say it's not for everybody, and if you're a very highly centralized organization, or you only operate in one country, I mean, fine. You don't need to worry about that kind of stuff very much. But in some cases you do. And I'd say most MDM software doesn't really, seriously address that today. But I think it probably ought to at least be thinking about it.
That's great. I've got one more question for you, and I'm kind of interested in your perspective on this as well. So I noticed that like a lot of the MDM and PIM systems have kind of originated in Europe, and when I went back and looked at Europe, it seems like a lot of the European environments are homogeneous, and the US environments seem to be heterogeneous in terms of having separate silos, if you will. And is that your perspective? Have you seen that as well? I mean, do you think Europe's ahead, behind? Kind of, what are your thoughts on
I think they're just different. It's not an ahead or behind thing. I think they're just different. I think, the US, has the big advantage of having, okay, I know there's 50 states, but essentially one giant market that pretty much obey all the same laws and so on. They speak the same language, and so on. So you can grow to a very large company indeed, in America, and just never worry about the rest of the world. And you don't have to worry about dealing with, multiple languages, or maybe you think about Spanish, I suppose, but you basically don't have to think too much about that. Europe's, if you're a European vendor and you're based in, Germany or the UK or the Netherlands, whatever, you say if you're in the Netherlands, I mean, you very quickly run out of room to grow, organically, if you're growing to a certain size of company. So from the very early stage, you have to think about managing across different environments, and where you're going to have potentially different operating units in different countries. You're going to have to deal with multi-language issues. You can't just put everything in English. You're going to have to worry about French and German and Swedish and da, 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 da. So you have to sort of build that kind of capability in right from the beginning. You probably don't have the same volumetric issues, because maybe in the somewhere like Netherlands got 20 million people. You don't have 320 million people like you have in America. So the sheer number of customer data records is not going to hit. So you don't have to worry too much about scalability and giant volumes, but you do have to worry more about sort of complexity. As you're having to deal with across these different countries, all of very different sizes too. So you may have subsidiaries in small countries where they have to have different systems. It's just not appropriate to have one giant system for everybody. So I think that's the sort of difference. The US tends to be a bit more monolithic in a sense of it's a one single market, and you get very, very large applications, very large companies that are primarily dealing with the US market or exclusively. And in Europe that's less true, because it's collectively it's 350 million people, but individually it's lots of little countries, and they've all got their own little quirks, different languages, different legislation, even though there's a degree of harmonization in Europe, across the EU. But we've seen that that's still not true of everything. And obviously there are countries who are not necessarily in the European Union. So there's all kinds of reasons why you have to worry more about sort of differences in Europe than you have to in the US.
Oh, that's great. Well, I guess my last thing is, and I always like to ask this in interviews, is did I miss any questions? What question do you think I should have asked that I didn't?
Oh, right. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. So yeah, I mean, I guess we've covered a lot of ground. I mean, I suppose I mean, in general, as always, I think with dealing with software companies, and obviously people are listening to this, hopefully, sort of mostly end user customers, I would always just encourage end user customers to, when you're looking at purchasing and implementing a new piece of software, whatever it is, whether it's master management software or anything else, I would just really, really encourage you to follow up on customer references and double check whether people in your industry have actually been using this software and what for. And it's just tempting because you think, oh, I'm just going to buy from this big name vendor. They must have loads of implementations of this because they're a really big company, and that isn't necessarily the true at all. They may be a big vendor because they grew big in another market, and they happen to have an MDM solution that might be actually quite substandard or quite highly limited in some ways. And you may well be better off with a sort of smaller, not a giant, sort of vendor solution that may actually be far better for your needs. But all I'm saying is really, always go and really poke around at the customer references. And I found it a very revealing process as an analyst, doing these customer surveys all the time, every year, survey after survey, and constantly flabbergasted at the number of customer references, even ones provided by vendors, who are deeply unhappy. So I get sent, we follow up a whole bunch of customer references, and I think from memory 30% of the sets of customer references I'm given by vendors have at least one customer who wouldn't recommend that product to anybody. and you see from the stores that they've given the stuff, it's not just like a typo either. I mean, they're clearly, not happy bunnies. So that's really is my message to customers about MDM software or any other software is it's very easy to get caught up in the sort of market, sort of the hype of the industry about some new thing and you just make assumptions about big vendors must be the best, and that isn't always true, as particularly in slightly more sort of specialist areas like master data management. So always go and poke around these customer references and look at products. Don't just blindly buy stuff from the biggest vendor that's been around for the longest. So that's just my little observation that's doing, and obviously this is, as I say, coming back to the very first question, why did VMedici score very highly on our assessment this time, is because they had the happiest customers. And it's maybe a smaller vendor than some people have heard of, but there's a reason why those customers are happy, and not customers of many other vendors are not all entirely ecstatic. So as a customer, caveat emptor, and just do sort of consider all the options and follow diligently up the customer references.
Great. Well, Andy, I'd like to thank you on behalf of VMedici and the audience. I think I appreciate your time. I appreciate your feedback. I think your insights are very interesting to think about and informative. So appreciate your time and hope you have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Al, and very much appreciate you asking me.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.